Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 19 in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. As we come to this section, we're actually asking the question, how did Lucifer become Satan? Now, just to back up and look at the entire couple of chapters that we're dealing with, back in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, um, Isaiah started a new section that's going to be a number of woes against a number of different countries, all Gentile countries. And he begins with a speaking against the city of Babylon, where we see in verses 1 through 5, the nations are gathered to bring judgment, excuse me. Next, chapter 13, verses 6 through 16, we have an announcement that the day of the Lord is coming. The heavens and the earth are going to be shaken, and all these pictures of judgment are given. The latter part of chapter 13 is where the Medes, they are coming against Babylon. These are the people from the Zagros to the east of Mesopotamia. And then as we come to chapter 14, there is a couple of verses dealing with the hope of Israel. And in lieu of that, or in line with that, I should say, we come to a section throughout the rest of chapter 14 where there's a taunt against the king of Babylon. And in the middle of that taunt, we come to the passage that we're going to be looking at right now. So I want to get a running start into it. Verse 10, in this taunt against the king of Babylon, they will respond and will say to you, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Notice this is the Jewish people speaking to the king of Babylon. You've become like us. We were taken into captivity. Your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Sheol is a reference to the grave. And because he's been brought down to Sheol, maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. That's sort of gross, and it's supposed to be. Now we come to verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. Now, those first two lines, how you have fallen from heaven, when we see that in the King James Version, the old King James Version says, how art thou fallen from heaven, same first line, but then it translates the next line, O Lucifer, son of the morning. And that's the only place in our English Bible, that is in the King James Version, where that name Lucifer, or that title Lucifer, whatever it's talking about, is used. Oh, Lucifer, son of the morning. Now, that's become almost a way today in popular culture to speak of Satan. You can ask 5 different people on the street, who is Lucifer? And they will probably all 5 will answer, well, that's the name of Satan. But the term comes from the King James Version. Now, when we compare this to other translations, for example, the New International Version reads, how you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. And you wonder, well, what happened to Lucifer? Or you compare it to the Revised Standard Version, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. And some people have looked at that and said, gee, all these modern translations are getting rid of Lucifer, and that's not actually correct. What's correct is that the King James Version put this term in there. And so we're going to look at the Hebrew, and we're going to ask the question, where did the King James Version get Lucifer from? So we have to look at that phrase, O star of the morning. The Hebrew takes that entire O star of the morning from one Hebrew word, and the word is the Hallel. Hallel. And when Jerome was the early church father who translated the Greek and Hebrew Bible. He did both Old Testament and New Testament, and he translated those into Latin. Now, there'd already been an earlier translation into Greek, but Jerome came from the West, and in the West, most people spoke Latin, and so it was good that he was doing a translation. He tried to do a good job, and it's Jerome that brought out what we call the Latin vulgate. Now, when we talk about something being vulgar, that sounds like it's nasty. But back then, when you used that word vulgar, you meant that it was common. It was the common translation. And that's what he was doing. He was trying to translate the Greek and Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Greek New Testament, and here in Isaiah, who was in the Old Testament. So he was trying to translate the Hebrew of Isaiah into the common everyday Latin of the people that lived in Rome and other places in the west side of the Roman Empire. Now, he came to this word, Hallel, and he was the one who translated it. He actually took two Latin words. Lux is the word for light, and fere is to bring. So he called it light bringer, Hallel, the light bringer. But the way you say that in Latin is Lucifer. And it doesn't mean the name of anybody. It means the lux part is light, and then the Ifer is the one that brings, so it's light bringer. And it was a reference back in Jerome's day to the planet Venus. Now, sometimes we call the planet Venus, we see it up in the sky, we see, oh, there's Venus. Sometimes, because Venus normally appears just before the sun comes up, so we refer to it sometimes as the morning star. And that was the idea of Lightbringer. It had that name. Yes, you could call it Venus, but you could also call it Morning Star, or the way you said that in Latin, the one who's bringing light just before the sunrise, the Lightbringer. Now that's what the term described, at least in Jerome's opinion, and he was pretty close to being accurate there. Now, it's funny because there's another place where Jerome uses the word Lucifer, and most people ignore this one because it didn't make it into the King James Version. But Jerome's Latin Vulgate also put that word in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19 that says, "So we have the prophetic word made more sure, to which you do well to pay attention as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns, and here it is, and the Lucifer," or my translation says, "the morning star," arises in your hearts. And Jerome put that word Lucifer here as well. Now, he wasn't trying to point to Satan by the use of that term. He was just indicating that was the morning star, what we call the planet Venus. And of course, it's being used as symbolism in 2 Peter. In 2 Peter, it's being used as symbolism for God's Spirit and God's truth that comes up and lights your way and announces more to come. Likewise, back here in Isaiah, it's also being used symbolically. It's not talking literally the planet Venus, fell down from heaven. No, it's what that planet represents. So there's a representation taking place here. Now, let's continue to look at, actually, what I want to do is bring in some mythology, because as Isaiah is writing to and about, he's writing to Jewish people, but he's writing about Babylon. He's going to borrow some elements of Babylonian mythology, possibly. I'll explain the mythology and we'll see if it fits. In Babylonian mythology, you had these two sort of, mommy and daddy gods, El, in which, as you come to the Bible, El is the word for God. El, or Elohim. Well, the same word was used for God, this master God, and there was the El and there was the Asherah, and they were mommy and daddy. And of course, if they're mommy and daddy, that means they have to have children. And so their children were Baal. You remember Baal was worshipped by the Phoenicians, but also there were these two twin gods, Shahar and Shalim, and they were twins. Sort of brothers and brother and sister of Baal. And Sha'ar in particular gives birth to another god, sort of lower down, known as Hallel, symbolized by the planet Venus. Just like when you look at the signs of the zodiac. And oftentimes you would look at these star systems and constellations, and in people's imagination, those stars would be made to symbolize this pagan god or that pagan god, and even the planets. Those stars that look like they were moving very slowly, but they were moving throughout the heavens, like Jupiter. Well, Jupiter's the name of a pagan god as well as a planet. And so is Mars, and so is Mercury, and so is Venus. And so Hallel stood for both the planet, but also for this pagan god. Now here it seems to be standing for the king of Babylon, or at least that which he represents. And so it asks the question, how have you fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn? You have been cut down to earth. Remember, this is part of a bigger passage dealing with Babylon. And the one representing the leadership of Babylon, the king of Babylon. You've been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. The passage goes on to say, verse 13, but you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. And it's a picture of, well, maybe of this pagan god, but more so of the king of Babylon who was claiming that kind of power for himself. I'm going to be bigger than God. Verse 15, nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol. Now, remember, we had an earlier reference to being thrust down to Sheol back in verse 11. And here it is again. You'll be thrust down to Sheol, is just the Hebrew word for the grave, or the place of the dead, to the recesses of the pit. Verse 16, those who see you will gaze at you. They will ponder over you, saying, is this the man, notice it doesn't say the angel or the devil, or is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness, and overthrew its cities, who did not allow his prisoners to go home? Remember, in the Babylonian captivity, the Jews were taken into captivity. The Babylonians never let them go back. It wasn't until the Babylonian Empire fell that the Persians came in and they said, oh, we're not the conquerors, we're the liberators, and you Jewish people and everybody else who's been dispossessed, you can all go back home. But the Babylonians did not allow that. Notice who did not allow his prisoners to go home. Verse 18, all the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you, by contrast, notice kings, when kings die, they're given a royal burial. But you, the writer says, Isaiah says, but you have been cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch, clothed with the slain who were pierced with a sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a trampled corpse. You can look for the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar. Now there's lots of kings that lived and died and we can't find their tombs, so I'm not sure that if this is significant. But you can look for the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar, you won't find it. Is that being pointed to here? I don't know if that's the case. That's just an interesting comment. Verse 20, you will not be united with them in burial because you have ruined your country. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers, and when he says that phrase, the offspring of evildoers, not be mentioned forever. The Hebrew there, Zerah, Ma'raim. Zerah is the word for seed. The seed of evildoers. And that reminds us of something way back in the book of Genesis, where there was a prophecy given of the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. And so maybe this does remind us, I don't think it's necessarily speaking specifically of Satan, but maybe it's supposed to remind us of that Satan connection going back to the very beginning. You see, we've been looking at the king of Babylon, but when we get to the latter part of the book of Isaiah, there's going to be another leader that is mentioned by contrast, and we refer to him as the servant of the Lord, although he's seen in Isaiah 53 as a suffering servant. The king of Babylon, we read back in chapter 14, verse 4, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say how the oppressor has ceased and how fury has ceased because he had been oppressing people. When we get to the suffering servant, we read in chapter 53, verse 7, he was oppressed And he was afflicted, down to chapter 53, verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. That, notice, he didn't do oppression, he was oppressed himself. In the case of the king of Babylon, he struck the peoples in fury, this is in verse 6, with unceasing stroke. When we get to the suffering servant, we see that we esteemed him to be the stricken one, smitten of God, and afflicted. In the case of the king of Babylon, he exalts himself as the day star and the son of the dawn, as though he were the planet of Venus, but is brought down to the grave. In the case of the suffering servant, he begins like a root out of dry ground, chapter 53, verse 2. But in the end, he is exalted, not self-exalted, but he's exalted by God. It's God who exalts him. In the case of the king of Babylon, we read, you've been cut down, you've been cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch. You will not be united with them in burial. You notice no place of burial. You come to the suffering servant, and his grave is assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death. Notice the contrast. In the case of the king of Babylon, he says, I will ascend into heaven. The suffering servant, he came down out of heaven. The king of Babylon sought to become like the Most High. The suffering servant emptied himself in order to become a man, emptied himself of his prerogatives, of his outward glory, to be born as a servant, to be born as a baby. The king of Babylon thrust down to Sheol, thrust down to the grave. The suffering servant, we read about him in the Psalms, his soul was not abandoned in Sheol. The king of Babylon is described as the offspring, the seed of evildoers. The suffering servant is described as the promised seed of the woman, the seed that connects us with God himself as we come to him in faith and repentance.